Hello everybody. Thank you for coming along to today's session to learn a little bit more about the new standards for VET across the country. I'm Morena Stanley. I'm one of the managers at the Training Accreditation Council here in WA, and hello to the online audience as well. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come and hear a little bit more about what these standards all mean. I hope you all have a copy of your standards. There'll be a test at the end of the session. Just kidding. Mine's becoming a little bit dog-eared already. But if you haven't seen them, you can access the new standards online through the Department of Industry website. There is a link at the end of my slide. And as I get to the end of my presentation, I'll give you information about where you can access all of this information on the TAC website anyway. So you don't need to memorise any web links, etc. We have all the information there for you. One thing that the new standards do is provide us a little bit more information about what is expected of training providers and regulators. So not only are there standards for VET providers, there are also standards for VET regulators. So we also have standards that we need to comply with, and of course they are monitored. The Commonwealth Government monitor our performance against the standards in the same way that the VET regulator monitors your performance against these standards. One question that has come up a little bit to date is, particularly from WA or TAC regulated RTOs, is do these standards apply to me? The answer is yes. You might think that's a silly question, but when you access the standards, you go to a Commonwealth law website and you might ask yourself the question, well, this looks like it sits in Commonwealth law, does it apply to us here in WA? We have our own VET Act, we have our own regulations, but the answer is yes. So these are the same standards for all providers delivering nationally recognised training across the country. Okay, so we do have a little bit of work in WA to amend our legislation to reflect the new standards. We're still working on that, but certainly the standards are as they are written for you all to read and understand. So just some overview information just to start with. The new standards were developed, for those of you who aren't aware, they were initially developed, some draft standards were developed by the old NSSC, the National Skills Standards Council. That's been abolished now, and we have a VET reform group within the Department of Industry. They took over the work last year, redeveloped the standards. Some of you will have seen previous versions of the standards, and most of you will be pleased to see that things like the AEO, the accountable, I've forgotten what the E stands for now, Education Officer, I think, and the LTO, the Licensed Training Organisation, those things don't appear in the new standards. So thank goodness those that were drafting the standards and seeking input from a range of stakeholders heard the feedback and decided against some of those rather onerous and burdensome requirements. So we don't have those, thank goodness. There are some new elements within the standards, and I'll go through some of those throughout my presentation. But in the main, it's much the same as what you've been doing under the AQTF. What we have been saying at TAC is that we do want providers to have a look at the new standards with a fresh approach, put the old AQTF to the side, look at the new standards, read every standard, every element. Okay, how does this apply to my business now going forward? Like I said, a lot of it is the same, possibly just worded it slightly differently, but essentially much of it is the same. There'll be some tweaks that you'll need to do, as we do, as the VET regulator, tweaks to our policies, processes, etc. to reflect the new standards. There's some new requirements like the annual return, things like reporting advising the regulator of your partnership arrangements. Some of those elements are new. As you will be, we are too in the process of developing up our new systems, etc. So some of those things are still a work in progress. We, like you, have IT systems we have to get up to speed and reflect the new standards. So we're all working towards that. But essentially there are some key themes around the new standards. They have really responded to quite strongly industry feedback about their input into the standards and how they'd like the standards to reflect industry needs and how training providers deliver training and assessment services in light of industry needs and requirements. Given that the currency, I suppose, qualifications and units of competency are really driven by industry through training packages, industry is very keen to make sure that their footprint is very much stamped across the standards. There is a focus, particularly, I think you've been probably living under a rock if you haven't heard that the Commonwealth Government in particular is about reducing the costs and regulatory burden on providers. That's across government, that's across the Commonwealth Government, across agencies, not just the vet sector. So we don't sit alone in that agenda. And the other thing also is, and I'll speak a little bit more about this as well, the standards do purport to establish a system that does reward high-performing RTOs. And so you'll see over time that the regulator's efforts should be focused more on those poor-performing providers, those where more effort might be required or more compliance, compliance activity may be centred around. And as I said earlier, the standards certainly provide a lot more information, we believe, to all stakeholders. So you'll see that they certainly provide, if you haven't already had a chance, do have a look through. If you have had a chance, I think you'll agree that they are more prescriptive. They provide a lot more information and a clearer understanding to stakeholders about what they actually mean and how to comply. There's stronger requirements also around marketing. This has been particularly an issue, probably more over east than in Western Australia. But the standards provide a little bit more rigour around the marketing and also information to students is a key feature of the new standards. Some of this, as I said earlier, may have been inherent in the old AQTF 2010. The new standards, like I said, you'll notice a little bit more prescription around what actually is required. So there's less of those grey areas. Should we be providing information to students about this? Well, the standards are much more prescriptive. They actually tell you, yes, you need to be providing this information, when you're providing that information, and in a lot of instances, how you're providing that information. Also, you'll find if you, after you've spent time just getting your head around the standards for RTOs, if you have a chance to look at the vet regulator standards, there's a lot more clarity for us as well about our role and our responsibility and our reporting requirements. There's also recognition that the standards across the board aren't a one-size-fits-all. So as I said earlier, there's a recognition that we have providers that are operating, across different industry areas, different levels of risk, varying levels of compliance, all of that sort of thing. So there is an attempt to be able to work with the standards to really work better on those specific issues. And you will find, this is a significant shift for regulators, that we will be providing more information, more guidance material to help you understand what's required of the standards. So you'll notice, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on, those of you who are aware of some of the material that ASQA has already published, the Australian Skills Quality Authority, the national regulator, they've already published a user guide. We will be as well, plus we'll be publishing some other material. That educative support doesn't apply at the point at which you're engaged in the audit process, but certainly outside of the audit process, there'll be certainly more resource material, information sources available to you. So on top of the standards, you have a greater understanding of expectations of us as the vet regulator. So into the standards themselves, there are 8. We had 2 or 3 or so pages of the standards earlier. Now you've got, what have we got? 33 pages. So certainly a lot more information to take in, but it's important to know, as I've stressed already, this really is it. This is the Bible as far as your compliance requirements go. You need to note that what's auditable are the standards themselves, the clauses, the schedules that are at the back of the standards, and the glossary terms. So all of that together form all of the parts that the auditors and we will be monitoring compliance against. There are context statements made throughout under each statement, and under each standard, and they're in blue, in the blue box in the standard themselves or under the standard. That's to provide some further guidance. That's not auditable, okay? So everything else within the document is auditable. So if there's a term that's defined in the glossary, then the auditors and TAC as the regulator will be looking to the definition of that term as to how that is applied in the context of that standard. If there's a term not defined here, then the normal dictionary definition would apply, and that would be our general view. And now I'll just go through each of the standards in summary as we just go through this presentation. I actually will defer a little bit around the standards and just talk generally around some of the key features of each standard, and not necessarily in the order that I've put up on this slide. We will be providing some information on our website which gives you some information about some of the key changes or some of the significant changes to look out for in the standards. So, which is the document that I'm referring to here for my notes, but certainly will be available to you very shortly through our website. A few new things in Standard 1 you need to look out for. Amount of training is the first one, Standard 1.2 in particular. The amount of training is an interesting one. It is defined in the standard. It brings up issues around the volume of learning, which is the AQF, which is from the AQF, remembering that the AQF comes into play from the 1st of January 2015 as well. So it's now the responsibility of the RTO to determine the amount of training required by each learner to enable them to meet the requirements for each unit of competency or module in which they're enrolled in. So this is around stopping and particularly, like I said, some of these issues are rampant more in the eastern states than they are here in WA, but it's to stop that, or really for not to stop, but for RTOs to properly justify how somebody can pick up a diploma in a weekend. You know, that sort of thing. You need to look at and consider the individual's prior skills and knowledge, and really, if questioned by the regulator or through the auditor, well, how have you determined that this course delivered in 2 days is appropriate for that particular learner? Okay, so be prepared to defend those situations. So whether it's an individual, a group, at the end of the day, you need to be able to defend how that individual, somebody straight out of school, for example, without potentially knowledge and skills in the industry area, can do a diploma of management in 2 days and be competent and issued a qualification. So that's very much set up to really hone in on those sorts of issues, which is good for the bulk of providers who do the right thing, is to stop those shonky ones who for a while have been, so to speak, getting away with those sorts of practices. Now you have, under the standards, you can quite in a way, lost the word that I was thinking of, but defend your practices. So actually, it will take you 6 months. From the time that we enrol you, we'll go through a process, and don't expect that this we'll be issuing a qualification in a shorter period of time. So the learner expectations are managed up front as well. So there's a protection there for RTOs too. Validation. You'll notice that the term moderation isn't across the standards anymore, but validation, have a close look at the validation requirements across the standards, 1.9 to 1.11. The RTO must ensure that validation is conducted by persons with a degree of independence at specific intervals. Okay, the standards are quite specific about this. And in addition to that, the validation process for each training product must be documented in regard to when the validation will occur, for which products, by who, and how the outcomes are documented and acted on. Okay, so there's a bit of continuous improvement in there as well. There's a whole section about validation of an assessment system. You need to have a really close look at that. There'll be some guidance in our guidance material that will assist you a little bit more on that, but certainly have a look at that. It will mean that you'll have to look at what you've been doing and adjust your policies process accordingly, okay? Standard 1.12 is around RPL. There's a specific requirement now for RPL to be recognised. So it's quite clear in the standards now that you must offer RPL, okay, where it was silent in the past. Trainers and assessors. I encourage you to have a close look at the requirements for trainers and assessors, so 1.14 and 1.15, and also then jumping to 1.21 and all the way to 1.25 around the delivery of the TAE training package. Okay, so there are requirements that come in from 1 January 2016 and then phasing into new requirements in 2017. So be very clear about those arrangements and that you have, we're not saying that you must have a plan for, the auditor isn't going to ask you for a plan of how you're going to address that over time, but at the point in time where we're coming to see you, you need to meet the requirements at that point in time. So they do change, they will change over time. So from 1 January 2016, there is a requirement for persons delivering training and or conducting assessment to either have the TAE 40110, Cert 4 or its successor, or a diploma or a higher level qualification in adult education. The schedule there, the specific schedule there also provides that additional information for you in the standards. There's requirements for individuals working under supervision, quite specific requirements, standards 1.17 to 1.20. Specific requirements for people working under supervision to possess certain skill sets, so look out for those. And as I said before, the delivery of the TAE training package. This particular area, there's some confusion around, there has been some confusion. The requirement against the delivery of the TAE is that the RTO must ensure that all trainers and assessors delivering any AQF qualification or skill set from the training and education training package hold the training and assessment qualification at least to the level being delivered. That's only applicable for the delivery of the TAE, not the delivery of any other industry qualification. Some people are tending to read that or miss something where they have picked up something somewhere that for them that they've carried that through to if you're delivering something in the metals and mining area that you too have to meet the qualification at least to the level being delivered. That's not the case. This requirement is only for the TAE, for the delivery of the TAE.
Okay, sorry, Morena, I was just going to ask you to say it once more because
yes.
It is such a
It is, isn't it? Yes, it is. So that's why I've stressed that point because there has been some confusion and particularly with RTOs working in partnerships with schools or other organisations. We've had those other organisations contact us confused about the requirement because they've read the standard and said, well, we think it reads this, we think it means this, and we say, yes, it does. However, they're being told something else by their partner. So be very clear, have a good read of that. It only applies to the delivery of the training assessment qualification. You'll find that somewhere between 1.21 and 1.25. And then from the 1st of January 2017, okay, the requirements change. So for RTOs, where trainers and assessors are delivering the Cert 4 training and assessment or its successor, they must hold also a diploma or higher level qualification in adult education or work under the supervision of a suitably qualified person, etc. So again, look at the schedule within the standard that it refers to for those specific requirements. And again, we'll provide some further guidance around that. Not much more than, it's quite specific in the standards. There's not too much more guidance that we'll be providing. So do have a look at it, and if you do have any questions, we're more than happy for you to contact the Secretariat. There's also much more information, more clarity around how you must handle superseded qualifications or units. So you'll find that under 1.26 to 1.27. There are specific timeframes, and they are identified within the standards. Okay, so the RTO is now required to meet specific timeframes in relation to the issuing of qualifications or units, etc., that are no longer current. That applies to skill sets as well. Although there is an exemption where for the transfer of issuing of certification where a training package requires the delivery of a superseded unit of competency. So that's quite prescribed there. It's very clear, 1.26 and 1.7. So there won't be a need to defer to any other policy outside of that. Most of you would be aware the Department of Training and Workforce Development had a policy around transition and teach out. The standards are what we'll be auditing against, okay? So standard 2, big emphasis around how you manage your third-party service providers. Partnerships, third-party, whatever you want to call them, the term in the standards is collectively third-party. The standards require that wherever you're engaging a third party, that there is a written agreement. And also there is a requirement that those third-party arrangements are monitored. And we also the regulator has the right to go to those sites as well. And so in the same way that we will audit the RTO, we will have the right to enter the premises or sites or talk to people at your service provider. Okay, so we'll be, in the same way that we talk to your trainers and assessors or we interview students, we'll be talking to your the relevant staff at the third party within any relevant people from the third party arrangement. Certification, standard 3, so this is a new requirement that where AQF documentation must be issued within 30 days of the learner being assessed as meeting the training product requirements, providing all fees have been paid. So that's fantastic. I know that's been a bone of contention in the past where RTOs have needed to make their own rules around that. It's not been for the regulator to prescribe how you manage that, but we're quite happy that it's in the standards now. So you have the right to withhold the issuing a qualification or statement of attainment if the learner hasn't paid. So that's important. Now, that's not to say when we come and audit you and we find one student that was issued their qualification on the 31st day, that's a major non-compliance, but we will certainly be, that's what the standard says, must be issued within 30 days. That's what we'll be looking to do, that you have processes in place and that learners do ultimately get their qualifications in a timely fashion. Standard 4, starts to touch on marketing as well. There's far more prescription around information that must be disclosed in promotional materials and the products that may be marketed on your, that includes people who market on your behalf, okay? So, so much more prescription. So really look out for that. There's lots of marketing and promotional activities that RTOs undertake around the state. So be very clear about what's in the statement, what's in the standards, and your marketing practices as well. Including how your partners market on your behalf. Okay, that's not out of scope of an audit. You'll notice the NRT logo conditions are now in the standards via a schedule at the back as well. Standard 5, which was the fee information, which was the old condition 5. So information around fees in advance, etc. Not to say there's any more information there, but it's certainly in the standards now. And also informing learners. So as I've already said, certainly a much more focus on, quite specific focus on information to learners during there. And also a requirement for RTOs to almost coach an individual into the most appropriate qualification or unit or training product for that individual. So maybe you've got, like the example I used earlier, somebody just coming out of Year 10 want to enrol in the Diploma of Management. It's really coaching them through whether that's the most appropriate pathway for them at that stage, and maybe coaching them through into a more appropriate training product. So we'll be, so certainly that's quite prescriptive in the standards, processes will need to, most RTOs will need to look at that and beef up the information to students and how they manage the learner before enrolment, prior to enrolment. So it's quite a key feature of the standards. Standard 6, complaints, policy and appeals. There's a specific requirement now for a written policy. RTOs are required to have policies and defined content to deal with complaints and appeals. And there is, written into the standards, a mechanism for an independent review of a complaints or appeals outcome where the complainant is not satisfied with the outcome. Okay? So where you may not have had that in your processes before, it's certainly a requirement in the standards now. So look out for that, standard 6.1 through to 6.6. Quite a lot of prescription around how you need to manage your complaints and appeals processes. Fit and proper person requirements. I haven't noted it in my slides, but it's probably more for the regulator. At the point of application, we've always looked at fit and proper requirements. There is in the standards now a list of requirements under the fit and proper list of requirements you must meet to meet the fit and proper requirements, and certainly our legislation has some requirements as well. So, so for prospective providers, if you're already a provider, you've already been through that process. But certainly for prospective providers, there's no different. Not a lot has changed in that area. Standard 8, as I said earlier, there is a requirement for third parties to cooperate with the vet regulator, so you'll need to let your partners know that in the same way that we may come and audit you as an RTO, we'll be making similar requests to interview your third party. So there shouldn't be any surprises if we call them up and say, look, we need to schedule our auditor on a particular day. There should be no surprises. So they should know up front that there's the potential for the regulator, the vet regulator, to come and visit. And then there's the annual declaration of compliance, which is new. We haven't prescribed what that's going to look like yet. We're still working on that, and I believe ASQA are as well. And as much as possible, where at the end of the day, as vet regulators, we need to agree on our general application and interpretation of the standards. So a lot of what we do will need to be very, very similar, particularly in the interpretation and application of the standards. We will be looking for that annual declaration to be a document that has a purpose. It's meaningful, and it is something that we can feed into other processes. For example, our risk processes in determining risk ratings, etc. We're also revisiting our risk framework. As a vet regulator now, it's defined in our standards that we must have a risk framework. It's always our intention to actually make that very transparent. So you'll be very clear as RTOs regulated by TAC what our risk framework is and how we risk assess you. Again, it's a work in progress currently, but we're certainly going to be very transparent about that. You'll know exactly how we gave you your risk rating by publishing the risk indicators in our process for identifying risk, etc., etc. So there shouldn't be any surprises there. And you'll have a sense of, okay, well, how do I get myself out of being a medium risk RTO to a low risk? You'll know the kinds of things that you need to do to get yourself there. I also would like to let you know that we are, many of you will have heard about ASQA's limited delegation model, which they've already published and invited RTOs to participate. The limited delegation for amendments to scope only. We're looking at a similar thing. So as soon as we've got more information to share, we will again publish information about that. It's a process over the next few months of legislative amendments to be able to even do that in the first instance, and of course then processes and reviewing applicable RTOs and going through a process there. So watch this space for a limited delegation, earned autonomy, whatever you like to call it. We haven't given it a name yet, but it'll certainly be on the cards soon. Most of you will be aware that even though the standards come into play on the 1st of January, or they're dated the 1st of January, to come into effect 1st of January. They certainly are for the Australian Skills Quality Authority. For WA, whether you're a prospective provider or an existing RTO, the standards will come into effect on the 1st of April 2015. Okay, we've recognised that we're all going to need time to get up to speed with the standards, update our processes, policies, etc. So there's a little bit of time up our sleeve. We have, as I mentioned, legislative amendments to make. We're aiming for the 1st of April 2015. We're doing our best to meet that, but there may, the possibility of a little hiccup closer to the time, but certainly the 1st of April is what we're aiming for at this stage. And the Commonwealth Minister was aware that certainly for WA and Victoria, with the quick implementation timeline for these standards, it was going to be impossible for WA and Victoria to implement these standards at 1 January. So we've got a little bit of breathing space. The new standards can be accessed through the Department of Industry website or through our website as well. We have a new tab on our website. If you go to the TAC homepage, just to the right, there's a new tab, new standards for RTOs 2015, and in there you'll find the links to the new standards. In time you'll find our users guide. We'll be providing a mapping document. I call it a mapping document, but really it just gives some guidance around the similarities of the old AQTF 2010 to the new standards. Having said that, as I said earlier, we're asking RTOs to really take a fresh look at the new standards, put the AQTF 2010 to the side for a little while. I know it's very tempting, okay, what have we got that's the same, and tick that off, and let's just put our energy into the bits that are different and where we've got to do some new things. But if you can spare the time, take a fresh approach. But certainly that mapping document is there to provide a little bit of guidance. We're providing some fact sheets which will support the user guide. So the fact sheets will be more of a ready reckoner if you can't, sort of have your user's guide to be flicking through all of the time. A stack of FAQs, which will be helpful, and we will be running some regional workshops in the new year. So if you're from regional WA, look out for those dates, again in that tab that we've set up on our new website, information about our further information sessions in the new year. Okay, so, and if you haven't seen our website recently or since we've revamped it, we do have a new website. So if you can spare the time, go in, have a bit of a browse around and see what's there. Okay, I think that is it. Thank you.
Authorised by the Government of Western Australia, Perth.